So here I am, Our Mind on Music, Season 3, Episode 63 overall. And I'm speaking with Lewis Gill, who is located in England, in Warrington, which is part of Cheshire, or is it? It
Part
is.
of Cheshire.
You were born in Warrington, and if I'm not mistaken, you've lived there your whole life. Is that correct?
Yeah. Born and
Yep.
bred, absolutely, yeah, yeah. For 55 years now, so yeah, it's in my DNA.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things that I found looking at your series, all the pieces that you've written about Warrington.
Well, it's music inspired by Warrington, volumes 1, 2, and 3, yeah. Only one of which is available as a CD, the other two are purely digital. Yeah.
So I guess one of my questions, it makes sense to me that you're in that place, as you said already, it's part of your DNA. So it's a place that inspires you. I'm curious, though, about how exactly that works, because I'm thinking about things that I've written about, places that I've been, experiences that I've had. And I think for me, I kind of, if I'm writing about a place, for example, I try to think of what is the spirit, the sense of that place, and then how would that sound? Is that how you approach, for example, I'm thinking you and I spoke about the Acker's Pit Concerto.
Each one of those pieces has a kind of biographical element to it, or autobiographical element. Like, for instance, Grasmere Skirmish. So I got beaten up there, actually. I got quite badly beaten up in Grasmere when I was a teenager, about 40 years ago. And that is pretty much inspired by that. If inspired is the right word, because that's quite a positive word, isn't it? That's kind of about that. And it's suitably aggressive sounding as a piece of music. Acker's Pit Concerto is about witnessing pretty bizarre behaviour. Homeless people and kind of idiots doing really odd things in Acker's Pit's just a part of it. It's next to Adam. It's like a lake, basically, in
Mhm,
Warrington.
mhm.
Where do you call it a lake? Yeah. Next to Stockton Heath. And I used to spend a lot of time there when I was a teenager. And on a few occasions, I've witnessed pretty bizarre things going on. Stockton Heath polyphony is kind of the idea is it's a depiction of it gradually becoming more and more busy as the evening goes on. So it starts off with a single flute, then more and more kind of counterpoint comes in. And by the time it's the full wind quintet, it's an illustration everyone's doing there. What they normally do, mundane tasks in Stockton Heath. Then it simmers down with each instrument gradually coming out as it's getting less and less busy. Say Westy Fragments, which is where I live in Westy now,
Mhm.
that's pretty much just melodies and chord progressions that have come to me since I've lived here. And I've just put them all together, in a way that kind of works, hopefully, melodically, harmonically, hopefully it does work. I don't know
Wow.
if that answers your question.
It absolutely does because what you talked about, I mean, I looked up, I was curious about what Acker's Pit looked like, was it actually a pit or what? And then I saw this like really serene fishing hole.
A small lake, but let's just say some questionable characters hang around there.
As we're speaking here in the episode, I'll be showing some images that I found online. There's a website that's called About Acker's Pit, actually. So
Right.
they have some photographs of the place, and I thought it looks like almost picturesque. There's actually a photograph like a stock photograph of two people sitting on what looks like a park bench, and they're just fishing off the bench into the lake. And I thought, man, I want to go there. I want to go fishing. I want to go walking there, and it looks so nice. And I thought, how did you come up with this music, which is it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel serene. It doesn't feel calm, and now you've explained why, because you're not, I was taking it quite literally that you were writing about places in Warrington, whereas you're writing about experiences or feelings that have happened in those
Yeah,
places, you know? So it's
people's.
inspired by that place, but very specifically in a moment in time. Wow.
Yeah, that's
That's,
right. Yeah, so it's as much as the place itself, it's people's behaviour within those places. Yeah, I think that's probably it for Warrington now. I think I'm going to move on, and I'd like to write a piece for solo piano, but I can't. I can't seem to get going with it.
hmm.
But that's my next stage, a piece for solo. I've had the go ahead, the green light from two professional concert pianists who have agreed to at least give it a go. If I send them a score, but I
Hmm.
just can't seem to get going with it. For some reason, I'd find it easier writing a piece for 10 instruments. But
Hmm.
solo piano, I just can't seem to get going with it.
What this just occurs to me now, this might be crazy, but I remember reading and hearing about when Prince wrote the song Kiss. He had recorded that song with a bunch of tracks. It had horn tracks and these big drums and it had all this stuff, and it was a very busy, funky kind of feeling song, and he hated it. And then he ended up giving it to another group, and they sheared it down to the sound that we're used to hearing now with that song, where it's just like a very sort of
Yeah,
sparsely instrumented
yeah,
song.
quite naked sort of sound, yeah.
Very, yeah, with the drum machine and stuff like that.
Don't have to be beautiful to turn me on. Just need your body, babe, from
And
dusk
then
till
he said, "Ooh,
dawn.
that's much better. I like that."
Don't need
I wonder, what if you were to write it with piano and nine other instruments, and then just take out the other nine other instruments?
Yeah, that
It's
could be a way around it.
it would be a crazy amount of work to not use those, but I mean, I guess theoretically you could release it in two versions. I remember when I
Or,
was studying recording and engineering, one of the courses that I was doing was composition. And we were talking to a teacher about how he worked for an advertising company. Aside from his teaching gig, he had I don't know, a full-time gig, I don't know. And he had been asked for a commercial. They wanted an instrumental piece to accompany this 30-second commercial about some product, who knows what. And he kept on sending them these, what he thought of as instrumental pieces. And they kept saying, no, 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 that's not what we want. That's not what we want. So finally, it was getting desperate and they were going to lose the account. And he asked the people, two representatives from this company, to come into his studio so he could just play a whole bunch of different files, and they could say which ones they thought they could work with. When they arrived, he was in a recording session for another song that was not instrumental. It had a singer in it. But at that point, the singer hadn't put their tracks on, so it was just the
right.
instrumental section of it. So there was no lead line, there was no melodic run for an instrument. It was just the chords and rhythm. The people from the company walked in and said, "Hey, that's it. That's what we want." What they wanted was instrumental in that there's no singer, but he couldn't take his mind off the sense that if it's instrumental, there still has to be a melodic line.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
an instrument has to play instead of a singer. So I tell you all that just to say, maybe rather than trying to write a solo piano part, you write a piece that has piano and take out all the other parts.
Yeah, yeah. And I could keep the other 9 parts for future projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's possible. One way of doing it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll consider that. Yeah,
One of the things that I love is so your composition, Black Odyssey,
yeah, yeah.
which, as I understand, you feel that that's one that's connected most clearly with audiences, that's been the biggest hit, I'll say.
It's yeah, it's had the most views by far. way
Okay.
by far.
Yeah.
And it's probably my favourite piece as well that I've done. Probably the piece that I'm most proud of. That and the Phobos Diary.
Okay. I would
Yeah,
definitely want to talk about the Phobos Diary as well. Um,
I've not
but
started work on the Deimos Diary just yet.
okay, I was gonna say you and I were
That
talking
was
about that.
your idea to do a twin piece called the Deimos Diary, but I have thought about it, but nothing's happened as yet.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, let's go there because people are wondering what the heck we're talking about. So Phobos and Deimos were in mythology were the sons of Ares or Mars, which is the god of war. And when they discovered that there are two moons to Mars, they called
Oh
them
yeah,
Phobos and Deimos.
yeah.
And you decided to write a piece called The Phobos Diaries.
Well, there's a kind of double meaning there, though. It's Phobos, as it's the god of fear. But I a long time ago, I used to suffer from anxiety and depression. And it was a kind of double meaning there. So it's a piece of music about anxiety and depression. But I have a keen interest in astronomy as well. So it's a kind of, I used to look at pictures of Phobos
Mhm.
while I was writing that piece as well. So it's a kind of double meaning there. It's systematic anxiety in a way, that piece. It's serialized, carefully structured, but it's just varying degrees of anxiety from start to finish.
Hmm.
Essentially, that's what it is. Yeah.
I looked this up after you and I had first spoken about the Phobos Diaries, and I looked up and phobia. If you have a phobia, that's where that word comes from, is phobos.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that. So phobos is fear, Deimos is dread.
Dread.
Yep. I was trying to think of what's the difference. I think fear, I can be afraid of a lot of things, but dread seems to be deeper, more long lasting. It would be, I think, closer to what the difference between sadness and depression, the difference between those two things.
Yeah. I think I took the word. I use the word phobos and fear in the broadest kind of sense. It's kind of depression and anxiety can kind of loosely come under that fear. If you have anxiety, it's almost like an irrational fear in a way. There's nothing specific you are fearing, but nevertheless you have this fight or flight kind of feeling. So I
Mhm.
think when I use the word, phobos fear, I think I did it in the broadest sense. So I've kind of covered dread already in a way. If I think of it that way, dread
Interesting.
as an aspect. So it's kind of comes under the heading anxiety in a way, doesn't it? But it's
Yeah.
slightly different in more specific sort of meanings. Yeah. I'd say so. Yeah.
It makes me think of a composer and I would say gifted improviser that I spoke with several months ago here on Our Mind on Music. His name is Stanley Stewart, Stan Stewart. He goes by
Right.
Muse for Now. So his music comes out under either Stan Stewart or Muse for Now. And one of the things that Stan and I were talking about was in music how we have the concept of tension and release. In pretty much every kind of music, there are degrees of tension and then release.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder, this is just a thought, but I mean, phobos, I would suggest fear, there's a tension or an anxiety, and then there is the release of that. Whereas dread might not release the anxiety. Stan was talking about there doesn't have to be a release. Sometimes the tension is just there and you learn to live with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not afraid of dissonance. Uh, I'm not afraid of dissonance in music, and I'm not afraid of dissonance in life. I think it happens a lot, and I think that the problem is that we get this idea, both musically and in life, that the way to take care of dissonance is to resolve it,
Hmm.
and that's not always true. Sometimes I need to learn to become comfortable with the dissonance if it stays. And I think think we have a large segment of the population that does not buy into my idea.
It's a difficult one to think of because even as a musician, one of the things that I teach my students all the time, especially when I am talking about improvising, is tension and release. Like in a song, you can build up a certain amount of tension, right? But at some point, the idea is typically to release the tension. So it's a difficult one, what you just said, but I can see the sense in it that if it doesn't let go, like you don't always have control of whether that tension is going to let go of you, basically, you know?
Yeah.
So learning to deal with that, I guess. You wrote something, I found this opening a bit of heaven on earth through spontaneous music.
See, the Phobos Diary, although there is variance, it does vary in its mood. It's still generally anxiety. It's still generally fear. I think if I was to write a piece, well, deimos, dread, I think it'd be darker. I think it would probably be more sticking with the horror of it, as
Yeah.
opposed to a kind of any kind of resolutions.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about your possible film music. Number
Yeah,
three, when I was listening to that, that's the one that has the sort of glockenspiel
yeah,
sounding
double
bell.
low double bass. Yeah, yeah, and those glockenspiels are kind of a bit like the stars in a way, a little bit like that. That was my thinking.
That's exactly where I was going to go with this because it has the glockenspiel, but then there's like that ominous string sound
Yeah,
at the bottom. And I thought that was interesting because I had watched a movie with my kids. Lightyear was a movie that came out
yeah,
a year or two ago. Very lighthearted, fun movie and all that stuff. But there's a moment where there's the girl who has to jump out of a spaceship and float through space.
right.
And as she's doing that, I could hear this, not a piece of music per se formed, but I could hear conceptually what music could sound like doing that.
Yeah,
And so I came home from the the cinema and I played around on my computer and I came up with this piece of music. And I thought it was interesting that I know you're inspired by space as well. And I thought, that's because that's what I thought. I thought the Glockenspiel gave me that sort of tinkly shimmering of the stars, you know. But then, listening to more of your music, I thought none of your music, as far as I can tell, is 3 minutes long, or very not much of it. How do you sustain that inspiration and build it to the very extended version of music that you actually come out with? I mean, a lot of your music is half an hour and longer.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. That's a good question. I use a serial technique, and when I use serialism, I can explore so many configurations of the same chords, the same melodies. And what I tend to do quite obsessively, I must admit it is quite obsessive, I won't let something lie until I have explored every possible avenue with themes and melodies and chord progressions. And the phobos diary is a good example of that. It could have been 20 minutes long. I mean, some people say it should have only been 10 minutes long. But I was determined to kind of go down every possible avenue with those, so there's as many twists and turns as possible, in light of using those serial parameters. I don't know if does that sort of explain it at all, or
It does. It does. And I'm wondering, the people who view our mind on music, there are musicians who watch this, but there are also a large number of non-musicians. So maybe you can explain a little bit, what do you mean by serialism? Like maybe we can get into the 12-tone technique, or however you would like to explain it.
a very brief outline of it. I like to use what Morton Feldman, the composer, said, that serialism is composing with parameters. But there is more to it than that. It goes way back, like, as you know, it goes back to Schoenberg, 12-tone series, and writing a piece of music that where all the chords and melodies are based on that row. There's no sort of deviation from that. What Boulez and Stockhausen did in like the 1950s, they extended that technique. So they could, instead of just having a 12-tone series, you could have a series of dynamics, a series of durations, a series of instrumentation like color. So in other words, you'd be giving yourself more parameters to work with. And the result would be you'd end up with a piece of music, if you follow these rules, that is somehow unified, because everything's balanced out. You're using the row of tones. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of melody and chords, it's going to be unified because it's always that row being used, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And the other aspects of it, the rhythm, the durations, the color, the attacks, even, it's all going to be unified in that respect, but balanced out. Having said that, I do break the rules. I don't it's not strict serialism the way Boulez used it. I'll have a certain amount of freedom to do what I want, even once I've applied those rules. I don't use it for every piece. I mean, a lot of that film music that you've heard, I don't think any of that was using serialism, any of it. And they're relatively short tracks, but the epics, Black Odyssey, Phobos Diary, and The Golden Square as well, very serial.
You mentioned Stockhausen, who, one of the things there was starting to use the electronic instruments, and then Bruno Maderna. So there are lots of things I want to talk about there. I'm afraid that if I don't go back to Black Odyssey, I'll forget my question, though.
Go for it. I'd like to talk about Black Odyssey.
We're going to come back to Stockhausen and to Maderna as well. But Black Odyssey, one of the things that I discovered was there are at least two recorded versions of Black Odyssey. One is for strings and one's for organ. I didn't tell you yet, but I've written a blog post about you and your music as well that I'll be releasing in tandem with this video.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I said in the blog post is that I put the links to both of those versions of the piece for people to listen to. And I'm hoping that people in the blog post will comment on their thoughts on the differences and the similarities and, maybe even which one they prefer if there is one. So I guess my question for you is, how did that come about? Was that like you felt like you hadn't fully explored Black Odyssey, or was it some other series of events that brought around two versions?
I think it was more like an intuition. Listening to Black Odyssey for strings, I could tell immediately that it would work for organ. I love Messiaen, and if you're familiar with Olivier Messiaen, he wrote a lot of very dark organ works, and I don't know, just on a gut level, I could tell it would work for organ, the way the chords worked, and it has I'd like to think, a spiritual aspect to it, Black Odyssey. It's inspired by black holes, which is very much science, but nevertheless, there's a kind of spiritual aspect to the music. And I think that spiritual aspect to the music transferred very well to organ. I think it gave it almost dare I say, a religious flavour. But the subject matter isn't really connected to religion. It's about black holes, literally black holes.
You said a sonic journey from the event horizon to the singularity. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's supposed to be, it's a bit kind of sci-fi, a bit far-fetched. Maybe some people would say a bit cheesy almost, And the truth is, if you were to enter a black hole, maybe you'd see nothing. I don't know. It was just an idea I had. If you could somehow be protected, enter a black hole, and go from the event horizon all the way to the singularity, what would you see? What would it look like? That was my thinking. And the music is supposed to somehow illustrate that. Whether it works or not, I don't know.
Oh, I definitely think it works. I wonder to what extent, I'm hoping that this chat that we're having right here will help people to visualize it in a different way, to understand it in a different way. One of the things I was reading, there's a writer who writes a lot about music, not only about music, but Ted Gia is the name.
Right.
And he's written a couple of books about jazz, and he's written, I don't know, thousands of articles. Anyway, he was quoting somebody who was talking about AI music, and is AI music going to take over the world of music and overrun human-made music?
I hope not, but go on, yeah.
The writer that he was quoting said that is unlikely to happen, at least for a very long time, because people don't listen to music for the notes that they hear. They listen to it for the story that the music tells.
Right, yeah.
And I think what you just described about your music is a great example of that. I've listened to that a number of times now, both the organ and the strings versions. Now I'll go back and listen to it based on what you just finished saying and trying to imagine that, like that movie. What's that? Interstellar. That's the one. Interstellar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But I'll go back and I'll listen to it trying to imagine that, So thank you for telling the story so I can go back and let the music tell the same story. If you were to pick any piece of music by Stockhausen that I could play here as an example of this, what would you choose?
I would choose Kontra-Punkte from 1952. Kontra-Punkte. It's a classic. So it was almost like a manifesto of the technique in a way, conducted by Boulez. And he serializes, 4 or 5 different aspects of the piece. And you can kind of hear it unfolding as it goes on. It's only about 13 minutes long, I think, something like that. But it's a wonderful piece. I think it's scored for 10 instruments. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that you say only 13 minutes. Just that, you know. So we've mentioned Stockhausen a couple times here, and fun fact here, you were in a group late 80s, early 90s called Cheeky Atom,
That's it, yeah.
and
Very
you
silly name. Yeah.
put, you put out a mini album, Jodrell Bank, Here We Come, 1990, and
Jodrell Bank, yeah. Again, there's a reference to astronomy there. A radio telescope in Cheshire called Jodrell Bank. And around that time, if you remember the band called The Smiths, they did an album called Strange Ways Here We Come. So it was a kind of play on words. There's a reference to that, but we were like into astronomy. So it was Jodrell Bank, Here We Come, you know.
and then you sent it to Stockhausen, Karlheinz Stockhausen.
I sent it to the Verlag, the Stockhausen Verlag in Curtin, Germany, yeah. Not expecting a response, but lovely of him. About 2 weeks later, I got a package with a letter. The letter praising the piece, praising the CD I'd sent him. Mm-hmm. Well, with a bit of criticism as well.
Oh, okay.
And a CD. He sent me one of his CDs, a piece called Octophony from the Licht Opera, which is a wonderful piece. So I was kind of shaking with excitement. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
Because if you're anyone that knows about the avant-garde, he's kind of almost a godlike figure. He's almost like the Michael Jackson of avant-garde in a way. So I couldn't believe it when I got that letter.
That's amazing. And you also received feedback from Markus Reuter from
Reuter, former member of King Crimson,
and tons of other things.
Yeah, I've spoken to him quite a bit on Facebook, social network. And again, I sent him a link to one of my pieces, not expecting a response, not expecting feedback. But he got back to me and he praised it. He talked about how much he liked it. See, with him, he's in a similar boat in a way because he's a composer himself, but with a background in progressive rock.
Right.
Which is just like me, really. You know, we both love Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells and what have you. So there's that kind of brings us together as well, in a way. You know, that was a connecting point for both of us. He's got another band called the Stickmen with Tony Levin. Tony Levin and some other former member of King Crimson. Brilliant musician and a wonderful guy as well. Because a lot of the prog rock bands I was into, influenced by, were themselves influenced by classical music, contemporary classical music. And I kept, like, if I'd read about Zappa, read about Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, classical names would crop up as in terms of their influences. So I'd just check out those people that they're influenced by. And one thing sort of led to another. I discovered edgardvarese through Zappa, aaroncopeland through Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Bartok through Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They did a cover version of The Barbarian. So I think with me it was a kind of natural progression to go to classical from prog rock. During the 1970s, I think they were untouchable. Well, the greatest trio ever, I think. It's only my opinion.
At the time, I was studying classical music, and I was quite young when I heard that. But it blew my mind to hear that fusion idea, and of course, I've listened to a lot of that since then. But I found that was really interesting. And I mean, King Crimson. I take your point on Frank Zappa when he brought up Valley Girls. People were like, "This is Frank Zappa. This is the Black Page guy."
Yeah.
Possibly the most challenging written pieces of music, I don't know, ever, and he brings out Valley Girl.
it's so challenging that only Steve Vai can play it. well, Dweezil plays it as well now. Dweezil has played it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, ridiculously demanding piece.
We started off talking today about you explaining how you wrote this thing about the Acker's Pit, which I thought, seeing the pictures, it didn't connect. It didn't make sense to me until you explained it. And it's a little bit like that. Like, how do you have the psychiatric challenge an evening of noise?
That's right, yeah.
And people would listen to that and think, how is that the same person who created this other piece, this calm? I mean, even the Bagatelles from Redeemer album, Bagatelle 5. I'm not sure if I could say it's peaceful, but it is flutes, so they're peaceful timbres, and then they have these rhythmic runs in them, and people would be saying, how is that the same person?
I guess I could say that it's all a reflection of my different moods, different kind of determination to get, different approaches of doing things out of my system. Really, Psychiatric Challenge was essentially a noise group. It really was sort of controlled noise, feedback. I mean, again, Stockhausen influence. Composed, it was all just okay. Let's just see what happens. I'll get my 30-second delay pedal ready. A guy called Dithering Tandog, who was in that group, would have his homemade synth. He literally made it himself.
Wow.
And Ian Simpson again was involved. He'd have a tabletop guitar, and would just say, "Okay, guys, let's just see what happens." Literally, let's just see what happens. No preconceptions about a tonal center or anything like that, or rhythmic ideas. And it would, invariably it would end up noisy and very avant-garde, very abstract. But I don't think there was anything dishonest going on there. It was me it was just expressing a different part of myself, really.
Yep.
Whereas the Bagatelle 5 for 3 flutes, that was kind of more experimenting with repetition in a purely compositional setting. I must admit that was very influenced by American minimalists. The Steve Wright, Philip Glass, Terry Riley kind of thing. So it's coming from a different angle again, But I'd like to think that there is a kind of thread. Someone listening to Psychiatric Challenge can hear maybe some kind of connection there between that and, say, the Bagatelles. Or even, say, Black Odyssey. So, you can tell, maybe you can somehow tell the same sensibilities behind a lot of that stuff. It's just different aspects of that sensibility. I don't know if that works as an explanation, but
it does. But I also want to bring up some more things that you said about along these lines, actually. So in June of this year, you did an interview with Progressive Rock Journal. And in there, you were describing Redeemer. You describe it as sitting between avant-garde classical and prog.
Yep.
And I thought, That's interesting because I've listened to it and I thought I don't hear the prog in there, but you explained further in the interview. You said, I suppose my use of odd time signatures and odd syncopations comes from Gentle Giant, King Crimson, UK, etc. When I think it's between avant-garde classical and prog, I'm thinking prog means plugged in and it means,
Yeah, yeah,
electric guitars, etc. But it's not so much that. It's a little bit like punk music not being about distorted guitars. It's about it's an attitude.
yeah, yeah,
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but what I take from what you're saying is that you're saying it's a prog sensibility, not
yeah.
that you're trying to sound like prog rock.
It's more like that. A lot of the harmonic language came from Prague. You know, harmonies or chords that would be, say, similar to what you'd get on, say, an early King Crimson album or an early Yes album, for
Mhm.
instance, but done in a kind of modern classical way, in a setting. You know, the instrumentation, harpsichords, and so forth, very rigidly composed. So, no, it's not prog as in someone's
Burgundy.
screaming lyrics about toadstools or anything. It's not, it's not that rock aspect of it. But the melodic and harmonic language of prog, early 70s prog, more specifically, really, uh, but brought over to a modern classical setting.
If anybody would like to read that article, I'm putting the link in the description to this episode.
Yes.
Progressive Rock Journal from June 3rd, 2024. I was listening to Gentle Giant because one of the influences that you mentioned, or, potentially where some of that came from was Gentle Giant. I was listening to Playing the Game,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, and I mean, actually, some of their music as well, even in that piece, which is just under 7 minutes, I think it's 6:45 or something like that. They're not necessarily playing those electric guitar sounds the whole way through. They're really playing around with the instrumentation of it as well too. So
Absolutely.
so you were on BBC Radio 6, your
Yeah,
music.
that's right. A program called The Freak Zone.
So yeah, Stuart
Every Sunday
McConey.
night, presented by Stuart McConey. I was flabbergasted when I got an email saying that he'd like to play a track. Bridgewater Dream, that was it. I couldn't believe it, and when he did play it, it was, oh my God, I'm on the radio. Oh, it's kind of that kind of
And
attitude.
and
Oh, yeah, it was
well,
wonderful, wonderful for that to happen. And it did. I have had quite a lot more YouTube hits because of that, or should I say views,
mhm.
and people contacted me as well. So it did open a couple of avenues up. That exposure on Radio 6. Only good has come from it.
So if you go onto the BBC website, you can click into that show. And I didn't know this, but I discovered that you can actually go back and see what was played on that day.
All the playlist, yeah.
The playlist that you were part of there, just that in itself,
King
wouldn't
Crimson as well, isn't it?
wouldn't that make you want to pat yourself on the shoulder? That was pretty
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
John Zorn, I think, was the featured album. John Zorn.
Hmm.
Yeah, there was King Crimson and quite a lot of interesting stuff. It was a good show.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I was quite impatient, saying, come on, play me, play me. I'd like more radio exposure if that was possible.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it, and part of it is, you've got a series of possible film music. So clearly, what you're saying is like, here's some music that could be used in a film, but you have actually written music for 3 films at this point. 3, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. A student filmmaker in Plymouth University, made what you would call a ridiculously short spaghetti western filmed in Plymouth. I wrote the music to that. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with him, and I'm proud of what I did for that piece. The other one was a guy at another film school in London who made a short film called Trapped. It's a bit like Groundhog Day in a way.
This is just a dream. This is just. Always. This is just a dream. This is just.
So it's a sinister. And again, I did the music to that. That is actually on my YouTube channel, that one, Trapped. And the other thing was a Dutch documentary filmmaker who chose some of my music. In fact, the piece you mentioned before, Possible Film Music number 3, that's what he used in it. Oh. But he remixed it. He messed about with it and remixed it and added loads of reverb and stuff. You can still just about tell it is that. So I've not quite gone to Hollywood just yet, but I would like to. I'd love to work with a big director, Martin Scorsese. Oh, God, David Lynch would be a dream.
Yeah.
What would David Lynch say?
Yeah.
Or over here in the UK, maybe working with Danny Boyle, the guy who made Trainspotting. So I really would love to get more into film scoring. I've had a taste of it, but only a taste,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, part of my question for you was that, because obviously you've been making these pieces called Possible Film Music, so you're sort of envisioning how that could fit those two things together, and then having done it now, part of the question for me was like, what are some things that you think might feel different about writing music than writing with the movie in mind,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So what would be some of the things that you would think, what are some differences? And then what are some aspects of that you find either freeing or constraining writing music specifically for a film?
I think, the constraining part of it is something I'd like, though. It'd be a particular subject matter, obviously the plot of the film. And that would dictate to me what the music needs to sound like. So there's constraints in that respect. But it'd be one that I enjoy, one that's a challenge. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not just completely left to my own devices just to intuitively make some music. I'm working to someone else's guidelines now. So I'm more restricted, but in a really enjoyable, challenging way. It's a chance to use lots of different moods, lots of different approaches, tempos, make the music quite crazy in a way. It's in that respect. So it's a compromise where I'm not just being left to my own devices. I'm having to work to someone else's guidelines, but in a way that I really enjoy. It's a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, I fully understand what you're saying. A good friend of mine is the director of a film festival in Toronto. It's called the Canadian Film Festival, CFF. In 2020, because of COVID, they weren't able to have the festival in person as they normally do every year. They've been having it for, I don't know, at least a decade now. And so my friend Bern Euler, he contacted me and he said, "Hey, we're going to be doing it online this year. We're going to be on these different internet television places and da da da. And now I need theme music because there are going to be moments where there's going to be nobody talking and it's just going to be the logo and we can't have that be silent. Can you write something for it?" I said, "Yeah. What do you want?" And he said, "Well, we're looking for doing it like a sort of a retro 1950s feel of going to the theater and it's like the intermission you're going to see, I don't know,
Yeah,
the 12 Commandments, and it's such a long film, they have an intermission. So I went with sort of a bouncy, jazzy feeling, what I thought
yeah.
they might play when they showed this logo. And it was interesting because at that point, I really had never written anything that sounded like that. And the only reason I did is because he had put that thought in my head. And I thought, well, you know? So I totally understand what you're saying. It seems like it should be limiting, like constricting in the sense of limiting, but I found it was more like um comforting, that
It,
it gave you a way forward kind of.
or even in a sense liberating because it brings something out of you that wouldn't normally come out
Yeah.
in that respect. I mean, Flying at High Noon, he wanted a piece of music that would kind of similar to Morricone soundtracks, the spaghetti westerns,
Yeah.
Good, the
I
Bad,
was
and the
thinking of
Ugly.
Ennio Morricone when you said that.
I plagiarized the rhythm. That thud, that boom, 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 boom.
Hmm.
I stole that, blatantly stole it, but then made up my own chords and melodies over it. So it was done in a kind of a derivative way, and there was a lot of humor in it as well. The whole thing was sort of slightly ironic, but it was wonderful to do. It was very funny and
Yeah,
very
well,
interesting.
it sounds like fun. You made me think of your sense of humor comes through in the music as well. As serious, as sometimes dark as your music is, then you have Neuroclang 2. You throw in these like I can't remember which one has the shave and a haircut motif. So how does that the Neuroclang, I'm listening and I'm like, okay, all right, I see what you're doing here, and you have this like, similar sounds to some of the other pieces on the album, and then and it does it quite a few times. What was the thinking behind that?
Maybe it was my way of saying, look, I do have a sense of irony here.
Yeah.
There is a certain amount of silliness involved in this, despite the enormous amount of planning and careful composition and notation and all that. Despite all of that, I do have a sense of humor, and I think maybe that was just my way of saying, look, you can have a chuckle now and then as
You
well.
can have a bit of fun with it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Yeah.
say, the Hollins Park memoirs, though, that's actually a different kettle of fish. The reason I included Happy Birthday, the tune Happy Birthday, because that track is supposed to depict the mental activity of someone with Alzheimer's. So
Mm.
Hollins Park is a mental institution in Warrington where
Ah.
it's retired people. And what I tried to do was illustrate with music what actually goes on in their head in terms of memories, confusion and memories. But with the Hollins Park memoirs, it was supposed to be, the patient is suddenly remembering when it was his birthday, when he was a patient there, say 10 years ago or something. Then it's suddenly flashing forward to some other confused memory. But
I'm
the
just
Holly's
thinking
part,
there's the happy birthday is a happy memory in the fog of
yeah,
not being able to piece together the memories.
exactly, yeah,
I wanted to mention a couple of things. One was I was listening to your music, and then because of the reference to Markus Reuter, I went and I was listening to Project Six, King Crimson from 2006, I believe.
yep,
Um, and it made me think of a friend of mine, actually a guy that I used to play music with in Qingdao back in 2007 or so. So roughly around the same time that Project Six came out. His name is Mark Montebello.
right,
He lives in Montreal, and he does a project called Drawing Drumming with his son who plays drums, and Mark plays live looped electric guitar parts. When I heard your music, I didn't specifically make that sort of connection, how similar these things are. But when I heard Markus Reuter doing some of his stuff with the repetitive, and he plays the stick, of course, instead of
yep,
strictly a guitar, and I made that connection, so I just wanted to mention that to you. I think I'll put a little clip of Mark and his son in here, just for you and the other viewers who are watching this to, just
yep,
see sort of another way of looking at this same approach to music.
yeah, yeah. Sounds interesting, yeah.
Moving forward for you, I read that you have plans to work with an artist with a very familiar family name, last name, Maderna.
Mariannemaderna, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest. She
Mm.
emailed me to say that she would like to use some of my music. In fact, it was number 3 again. It was possible film music number 3. She
Wow.
wanted to use that as part of an installation that she was doing.
Mhm. Fascinating art, and I think she's had a very successful career. So I think probably it's just trying to manage
Yep.
all of the things that she's doing.
Yeah, yeah. But that would be wonderful if she did
Yeah.
use my music. It'd be wonderful.
Lewis, one of the things I love to ask is there a question that you wish I had asked, but I didn't ask?
Not really, no. I think you've covered more than what I expected, actually. No, you've covered everything. It's been a pleasure. Superb. Yeah, it's wonderful opportunity. I appreciate this big time.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. I really love talking. I mean, I love talking about music with everybody, and then, you've given me some different perspectives that I might not even have thought about otherwise, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I do appreciate you chatting with me.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, we have a nice day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Good night.